Most European states were overrun by the Axis powers at the beginning of the Second World War. We might think of countries like France, Belgium, Denmark, or Poland. But one island put up a fierce resistance and earned a reputation for being impregnable: Malta. And not because it declared itself neutral or was extremely remote. No, Malta was one of the most important bases of the Allies and was situated in the most central Mediterranean location, less than 200 kilometers from Italy and exactly in the middle between the expeditions to Africa and the Axis powers. It was thus isolated from its allies and surrounded by enemies. Malta therefore became one of the primary targets for the German and Italian bombers from the outset. Hitler even wanted to completely obliterate the island, but Malta proved to be one of the hardest nuts to crack in the war. Although it was besieged for 2 years and bombarded continuously, historians now describe Malta as the most bombarded place of the entire Second World War. Neither Hitler nor Mussolini managed to force the island into submission. On the contrary, Malta's endurance marked the turning point in the African campaign and eventually led the Axis powers to surrender. So, how did such a small island manage to withstand this massive power? Why was Malta one of the most important battlefields of the war? And how did it initiate the turning point in the conflict? We will look into all these fascinating questions in today's video. Enjoy! Malta had been considered one of the strategically most important islands in the Mediterranean since the dawn of history. Therefore, all the major powers of the Mediterranean region constantly fought over the archipelago, which consists of the main island of Malta and the two small but rather insignificant neighboring islands of Gozo and Comino. I will refer to the main island of Malta. It became part of the British Empire starting in 1800 and quickly developed into one of the most important crown colonies. From Malta, the British could monitor the entire Mediterranean, and thus the headquarters of the Royal Navy was established there. The strategic importance increased further with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, which drastically shortened the route between Great Britain and the colonies in Asia. And it was already during the Crimean War and later the First World War that the importance of Malta for the British became apparent. Even then, it served as a coordination headquarters, communication hub, and one of the largest hospitals for the Allies. But Malta's role would grow even further in the coming decades. In the 1930s, the rivalry between Great Britain and Italy grew, as Italy increasingly reached into Africa, conquering not only Libya but also distant territories in East Africa. Thus, Mussolini had already formulated a plan in 1936 for the conquest of Malta. Great Britain initially underestimated the danger of a large-scale war, but with Germany's invasion of Poland, everything changed. The appeasement policy had failed, and preparations for a confrontation with the Axis powers began in earnest. So also on Malta, though only on a relatively limited scale. Measures for food and water security were put in place, air raid shelters and protection bunkers were dug out, and a contingent of the Royal Air Force was stationed there for defense. But all this was relatively little. The British feared an invasion of Great Britain following Germany's attack on France and focused their main efforts on this defense. It became clear that the Maltese would primarily have to fend for themselves. However, it was clear to them that they would defend the island to the last man. And so the theatre of war in Malta began on the 11th of June 1940, just one day after Italy entered the war. Initially, the British military assumed that the island, which was only half an hour's flight from the Italian airfields in Sicily, would not be held for long. Thus, initially only about 4,000 soldiers and 6 biplanes defended the island. However, the Maltese formed militias and quickly dug out massive tunnel systems under the island to protect themselves from air raids by the Axis powers. Thus, the first Italian bombings caused only limited damage. In hindsight, this was incredibly important for the morale of the Maltese and the British. Malta did not seem so easily conquerable after all, and once the British were able to fend off an invasion of Great Britain, they focused on the Mediterranean. North Africa, in particular, was to become one of the most important battlefields of the war. At the beginning of 1941, the German Reich dispatched the newly formed Afrika Korps there, advancing relentlessly towards Egypt. If the country on the Nile fell, the Suez Canal would be lost and Great Britain would be cut off from its colonies and further reinforcements. But it had an ace up its sleeve. Malta. For the German and Italian troops needed to be sufficiently supplied in the hostile desert. And this is where the British came in. The supply routes to Africa were repeatedly disrupted. The British therefore moved more and more ships and aircraft to Malta to carry out targeted pinpricks against the Axis powers. Particularly, the Italian Navy was repeatedly decisively defeated, and German logistics were severely weakened. Hitler was driven to fury by this and wanted to destroy Malta once and for all. Starting at the end of 1941, an unprecedented bombing offensive against the small island was launched. Malta was effectively under siege. The Axis powers cut the island off from all supply routes through air attacks and naval blockades to force the British forces into surrender. But the fortress of Malta held its ground. The population and the military endured in the specially constructed tunnel systems, despite hunger and despair. For it was clear, Malta must not fall at any cost. And so Hitler and Mussolini agreed on the next stage, Operation Hercules, the invasion from the air and by sea. The attack was to be carried out by 3 airborne divisions with about 30,000 men, supported by 70,000 soldiers landed from the sea and tank battalions. That would have been the end of Malta. But everything turned out differently. The German troops were already in Italy ready and waiting for the attack order. But Hitler called off the invasion at the last moment. In a decisive victory, the British stopped the Germans in Egypt, and the soldiers were now needed on that front. Operation Hercules was initially cancelled, and the focus shifted to even more intense bombardments. In total, the island was hit by about 14,000 tons of bombs during approximately 3,000 attacks, making Malta the most bombarded place per square meter during the Second World War. Moreover, it was still completely cut off from reinforcements and supplies. By August 1942, Malta was on the brink of capitulation. But salvation came with a transport convoy, the so-called Santa Maria convoy, which reached Malta on the 15th of August after severe losses and thus broke through the siege ring for the first time in months. This marked the turning point in the siege. The convoy brought not only urgently needed supplies, but also military reinforcements for the defenders of Malta. Additionally, the power of the Axis powers waned. Malta became the starting point for Allied operations in the Mediterranean once again. From Malta, they carried out air raids and amphibious operations to fight the Axis powers in North Africa. This contributed significantly to the recapture of Libya and Tunisia. And a year later, the island also played another important role, namely in the preparation and execution of the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, known as Operation Husky. Malta served as a base of operations and connection point for troops and supplies needed for the invasion. The subsequent invasion of the Italian mainland was also planned from Malta. At the beginning of 1945, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the USA and Great Britain, as well as the foreign ministers of both states, met there for the Malta Conference to discuss the further course of action after the war. Malta thus became one of the most important strongholds of the Second World War. But the Maltese population could finally breathe a sigh of relief. With iron will and enormous fighting power, they managed to defend their small island against a massive power. The bravery and determination of the Maltese people were honored with numerous awards and decorations. Malta was eventually awarded the George Cross by the British King personally, which was considered the highest honor in Great Britain. The Maltese were so proud of this that it still adorns the country's flag today.